We're so excited to see you. Good morning. My name is Jana Martin, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 29th Annual Katherine White Lecture Series featuring our keynote speaker, Dr. Patricia Poitevin, a dynamic and renowned speaker, medical educator, and mentor. She will talk with us about dismantling and disrupting circumstances and structures which result in mistreatment, stifling, discriminating against, marginalizing, ignoring, and hurting others in our medical environments. Something which Dr. Katherine White not only wouldn't tolerate, but also wasn't afraid to stand against. We're also fortunate to have among us three very important and energizing leaders in the education in our wonderful Long Beach Unified School District. Dr. Tiffany Brown, Ms. Lachelle Diggs, and Ms. Sharon Barker, who will highlight LBUSD's efforts to dismantle racism in our school system. They will present after Dr. Poitevin answers questions. We encourage you to stay and hear from them about the wonderful things they are doing. There are several members of the Long Beach medical community, Miller Children and Women's Hospital, who have been integral to making this happen today. I'd like to call them out. Daisy Rosado Cantrell, who's the immediate past director of graduate medical education and the Center for Health Education. Angel Arvizu, lead graduate medical education coordinator. Dr. David Michalek, infectious disease specialist and program director of pediatrics. Mr. Ron Gonzalez, president, Long Beach Medical Center Foundation, Miller Children's and Women's Hospital Foundation, and Yair Katz, chief executive, Miller Children's and Women's Hospital. We also want to acknowledge Dr. Elisa Nicholas, chief executive officer, and Dr. Maria Chandler, who is working with Dr. Nicholas is Chief Executive Officer and Dr. Maria Chandler is Chief Medical Officer of the Children's Clinic, and Dr. Candace Taylor Lucas, a pediatrician with UCI Health, who recommended Dr. Poitevin and facilitated our acquiring her as a speaker. Last but not least, I want to acknowledge Dr. Katherine White's family. Her granddaughter, Susan Vaughn, who's sitting over there, who is with us today with her special guests that we welcome, and Katherine's great-granddaughter, Madison Vaughn, Susan's daughter, who unfortunately is unable to be with us today. Susan, following in her grandmother's footsteps of caring for others, has spent her entire career as a social worker. For 23 years so far, and she's still going, she has worked helping people with developmental disabilities. Through her work, she has helped countless numbers of people, making a difference in their lives. Thank you, Susan. I'd also like to acknowledge Becky Qualls and her wife, Sue. Becky is also a beloved granddaughter of Dr. Katherine White, who has dedicated her life to teaching and caring for special needs children and their families for 26 years in the Long Beach Unified School District. In numerous ways, Becky ensures that Katherine's legacy continues with the same energy and import with these lectures as it did when Katherine was alive. And Sue would have been a favorite of Dr. Katherine's, no doubt. For over 30 years, Sue has guided students and families through the college admission process. She's been the person who has helped young people see the potential they don't even know they have and hold hands with their parents, tell them not to shove too hard, give them the right guidance, but matching those students with an environment which will nurture them and benefit in the long run. We want to thank the family for all the impact you have had on others in your careers and for ensuring that the legacy of your grandmother is alive and well even these many years after she left us. We thank you very much. To set the stage for today, I'd like to share with you a quote, and I'd like for you to let it resonate with you just a bit. It's a quote by Michelle Obama. "Don't ever make decisions based on fear. Make decisions based on hope and possibility. Make decisions based on what should happen, not what shouldn't. Dr. Katherine and Dr. Patricia Poitevin are exemplars of this quote, making countless decisions based on hope and possibility, not fear, and making decisions based on what should happen. We and so many others, past, present, and future, are among the many beneficiaries of Dr. White and Dr. Poitevin's wonderful passions, tireless efforts, and decisions. Dr. Katherine White was a pioneer in medicine for women. As a scholar, as a pediatric chief resident in her early 20s, and as someone who advocated not just for those who could not advocate for themselves, but for those whose voices were ignored due to their ethnicity, income level, differing abilities, or other demographics. Dr. Katherine made a decision to be inclusive, supportive, and active. Health equity was important to her, as well as well-rounded training for residents and physicians, training which focused on provision of excellent medical care and personal concern for all patients and families, regardless of their circumstances. Dr. Katherine knew what should happen, and she modeled for those of us who knew her how not just to care about other people and about these concerns, but to activate and advocate, how to focus on hope and possibility. She was what Dr. Poitevin would call, as you'll hear soon, an ally, an actor, and an accomplice. One of the many decisions that Dr. Katherine made was to provide generous financial support to make possible these things should happen. She established 3 endowments for children's health care, including one through the Memorial Medical Center Foundation to support this outstanding series. Her wisdom in investing in the future is paying off for all of us and for generations to come. Dr. Katherine was recognized in the community as an activist, as a spirited woman, and was a recipient of many honors. As meaningful as those honors were to her, what gave her true delight was helping others receive the recognition that they deserved, recognition in her mind that was shown by equitable health care, inclusivity, value and respect as human beings, and elevating voices that deserved to be heard. I know Dr. Katherine would have picked Dr. Poitevin herself as our keynote speaker. Dr. Poitevin is passionate about medical education, as was Katherine, particularly around issues of mentorship, diversity, and evaluation. She believes that how we teach and how we care for patients must be informed by an environment that is inclusive and representative. As the Associate Professor of Pediatrics in the Division of Pediatric Hospital Medicine and as Senior Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Warren Alpert Medical School of Brown University, Dr. Poitevin is making decisions based on hope and possibilities with her research on inclusion and mentorship of underrepresented learners in academic medicine. For example, she was the founding member of underrepresented learners in academic medicine of the Association of Pediatric Program Directors Learning Community and is currently their president. She is a well-respected presenter and stimulator of thought and action, who has lectured nationally on disparities and inequities in medical education. We are privileged to have her with us. As reflected in the title of her presentation today, and by her demonstrated path towards radical authenticity, Dr. Potvin is a disruptor. And Dr. Katherine, affectionately called Granny by her family, would have loved that. And she would have loved Dr. Potvin's grandmother, too. Dr. Potvin, whose parents immigrated from Haiti, was blessed to have very strong women role models, especially her grandmother, whom she describes as the most incredible woman she has ever known. She sounds like a granny many of us know and loved. Behind Dr. Potvin's drive to focus on what should happen is information that is rooted in her connections with her grandmother. Her grandmother, one of her grandmother's many inspirations for her was, "Don't eat anything cold." And she hasn't. Dr. Potvin has lived and worked full speed personally and professionally. She recently ran a half marathon, loves and reads a lot of fiction, has a passion for baking, and is a nurturing mom and partner. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Patricia Potvin, a disruptor for hope, possibility, and action.
My goodness, what an introduction. Thank you so much, Jana. It is really a pleasure and an honor to be with you all today. I did not know Dr. Katherine personally, but I've had an opportunity to sit and hear so many wonderful stories about her legacy here. And I really hope, or I think I'd like to imagine, that we would be very good friends. I'm really honored to be even spoken of, really, in the same sentence as her. And I hope that this talk is a good representation of how I like to disrupt things. And certainly, in honor of Dr. White, I think that's really appropriate. So thank you all for having me. The topic, or the title of my talk is Dismantling Racism in Medicine, Making a Disruptive Toolbox Using the Master's Tools. And I really only have one disclosure for you all, and that is that I am a Black woman in academic medicine, which means I am a part of a tiny sorority. Only 1.7% of physicians in academic medicine are Black or African American women. So as a result, this is deeply personal work. My hope is that the data that I present today will help to tell a story. And that story doesn't only belong to me. It belongs to many individuals who are underrepresented in the spaces where I spend most of my days. But it is certainly reflective of many of my personal experiences. And I'm telling this story to you all in an effort to raise awareness, but more importantly, to activate us to help everyone become an agent of change. My goals and objectives today are to illustrate the impact of racism in medicine, describe how racism impacts the clinical learning environment, empower you all, the audience members, to really make change and to disrupt our current systems, and to highlight some promising practices for making our clinical learning environment more inclusive. The title of my talk, not surprisingly, is based on a speech given by the great Audre Lorde in 1984. For those of you who don't know, Audre Lorde was a poet and an activist, and really made significant contributions to what we might call disruption and inclusion now, but certainly did not have that moniker back when she was doing her work. She published a speech, or rather she gave a speech in 1984, and it was entitled, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." In this speech, she says, importantly, that those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbian, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths, for the Master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Now, not surprisingly, this quote serves as an inspiration for this talk. And although in the title I say very clearly that I think we can dismantle the master's house utilizing the master's tools, it's important for me to frame that context. As Audre Lorde puts forth, those differences for those of us who are marginalized really must become our strengths. And I believe that wholeheartedly. I think the reason why marginalized people are marginal and individuals who are minoritized remain in the minority are actually great strengths, which may or may not be recognized by our society at large. And I know personally that my identity and all of my experiences as a Black woman, a first-generation physician from a Haitian immigrant family, a mother to 2 Black boys, a wife to a Black husband, make me a better doctor, a better teacher, a better mentor, and a better leader. My intersectional identities show up in my work all the time. And so I have learned how to make my differences my strengths. And I believe that one of my strengths is actually to subvert the master's tools in order to take down the master's house. Not surprisingly, the idea that tools, which are tools of oppression, can actually be utilized to disrupt systems of oppression might be hard to believe, but I do think that it can happen, and that's what I'll be talking about today. Now, Ms. Lorde used the symbol of the master's house to represent the structural isms that oppress marginalized people. And although a house is something tangible and concrete, arguably easy to see, racism is not. Racism is insidious. It is embedded in everything we do, which makes it very hard to tease out. It is the ability of racism to undergird all of our assumptions of reality, which makes it so dangerous. Now, for the sake of clarity, I will use Kamara Jones's definition of racism for the rest of this talk. She defines racism as a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of race, and goes on to define race as a socially constructed way of grouping people based on skin color and other apparent physical differences. Now, this grouping has no genetic or scientific basis. It is completely socially constructed, and it is socially constructed in order to give power to some over others and to justify social and economic oppression. And if you think about social construction, they're really just social groupings that have changed over time and vary around the world. They're crude and often inaccurate proxies for socioeconomic status, culture, and genetics. And the precise measurement of social classification of people in a race-conscious society is nearly impossible. And so once you understand the fallacy behind the creation of races, you can understand just how absurd, really, racism is, except for the fact that it serves a very specific purpose, and that is to support systems of oppression. Now, I'd like to introduce you all to someone. This is Eleanor Equity. And Eleanor is going to be following us throughout the presentation. We're going to talk about her experiences as a pediatric intern. Now, she's a newly recruited intern who has just started on the wards with you. And you're excited because you interviewed Eleanor during the recruitment season, and you remember how amazing she was. She's interested in pediatric hospitalist medicine, and she emailed you after your interview and seemed pretty excited about the program, especially the Division of Pediatric Hospitalist Medicine. This was despite the fact that there is not a ton of diversity in your department. So you, as a majority faculty member, felt really good that you helped to recruit her. And as a result, you've also been assigned as her advisor, and you're thrilled that she's joining the program. Now, Eleanor turns out to be a rock star. She blows everyone away during her first wards rotation. People are already saying that she's pediatric chief resident material. And after a quick meet and greet, you schedule your first advisor meeting with her. In your meeting, you also find out that Eleanor is having a great time. This has really been her dream for as long as she can remember. She was a little bit nervous about joining a program where there didn't seem to be a lot of representation. But she was here for the patients, many of whom looked just like her. Being in the minority wasn't new for Eleanor. She had just hoped that as she moved forward in medicine, she would have fewer experiences of being the only. But she was there to do the work, and she was there to learn a lot. She was glad to have you as her advisor. She wanted to keep many of the Black women advisors that she had had throughout medical school, but understood the importance of having advisors who did not look like her, who could guide her through a path, in particular a path that where really so few of people looked like her. She really felt that you were going to be a strong advocate for her and was starting to feel a real kinship with her residents. And she was having such a good time in your program, she even began to entertain the idea that she might stay on for PHM fellowship after residency. Now, Eleanor's lived experience of being the only in her training program shouldn't be a terrible surprise to anyone practicing medicine in 2023. In pediatrics, we have been grappling with workforce diversity for over 20 years. In 2013, the AAP Committee on the Pediatric Workforce issued a policy statement bringing attention to this fact. Notably, they had also previously issued policy statements in 2000 and 2007. The policy statement reinforces our roles as pediatricians in advocating for a diverse workforce and highlights not only student, resident, and faculty recruitment activities, but importantly, institutional commitment to ensure that individuals of diverse backgrounds can rise to leadership positions. So if the AAP, the largest organization of pediatricians in the US, wrote this statement back in 2013, why on earth am I still here talking about racism in pediatric medical education? Maybe it's because we've been doing a crummy job. We haven't been explicit enough about calling out racism, and we haven't been invested in truly dismantling it. So in an environment where patients are treated inequitably because of racism, we would be foolish to think our learners are not vulnerable to the same forces. The pool of students from historically underrepresented groups who apply to medical school is already significantly lower than white students. This disparity only worsens as we move through the process of getting into medical school. So as this graph shows, the average acceptance rate to medical school is approximately 41%. What you'll also notice this graph shows is that all of the variability in rates aligns with differences in racial and ethnic self-identification. So in 2016, white applicants enjoyed a 44% acceptance rate at one end, and Black or African American students or applicants had a 34% acceptance rate at the other end. In academic year 2018-19, the numbers were astonishingly similar. So we start with a small pool of underrepresented students, which turns into an even smaller number of resident applicants. Of all applicants to pediatric residencies in 2018 through 19, only 8% were Black and African American, 5.9% were Hispanic or Latinx, and less than 1% were American Indian or Alaskan Native. When comparing the demographics of pediatric trainees to individuals in the US population, all you have to do is compare the blue bars to the red. For every minoritized group, we fall extraordinarily short of having similar representation in our trainee workforce. This data is from 2019, and the AAP issued its statement on workforce diversity in 2000. So 20 years after that statement, here we are. And when you look at this data going back to 2007, the green line representing the percentage of underrepresented groups in the United States population, and the blue and red lines representing percentage of underrepresented in medicine, pediatric residents, and fellows respectively, you'll find where we are is exactly where we've been. We are clearly not making progress. The numbers of full-time underrepresented in medicine faculty have only increased minimally over the last 50 years, with the greatest rise between 1979 and 2018 among Hispanic faculty, whose numbers grew from 2.5% in 1979 to 5.5% in 2018. The increase for American Indian faculty for African American and American Indian faculty was infinitesimal in comparison, 1.8 to 3.6% for Black faculty, and 0.1 to 0.3% for American Indian faculty over exactly the same time period. The highest proportions of all URM faculty in 2018 were found in 4 departments: obstetrics and gynecology, public health and preventative medicine, family medicine, and pediatrics. Yet even in those 4 departments, the proportion of URM faculty was still less than 16%. So we're celebrating that the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology nationally can count 15.9% of their faculty as URM faculty. That's a big celebration. In pediatrics, it's only 11%. So clearly, we are simply not meeting the mark. And that small number of historically underrepresented faculty continue to dwindle due to attrition, as Dr. Blackstock outlines perfectly in an essay that she wrote in 2020, where she describes her own departure from academic medicine. She writes, "I never thought I would leave. My presence and work was significant to my patients, students, and colleagues. But I could no longer stand the lack of mentorship, promotion denial, and work environments embedded in racism and sexism." Now, Dr. Blackstock is an emergency medicine doctor, but I can assure you, those of us in pediatrics have experienced the same. I myself have been characterized as not really academic, despite holding leadership positions at academic institutions my entire career, literally starting as a pediatric chief resident. I have been called lots of names: ambitious, driven, single-minded, and passionate, all by white men and women in positions of power, and never in an encouraging or congratulatory way. I was even told during a meeting with a supervisor, meant ostensibly to make sure I was keeping up with my promotion timeline, as I am a faculty member in an academic institution, that my stated goal to publish was foolworthy, because I would never be the chair of an academic pediatrics department. So what was the point? I often reflect on these moments and marvel that I am still here at all. Our ongoing challenge in recruiting, training, and retaining a diverse workforce is often symbolized by a leaky pipeline, but this analogy is wholly inappropriate. If you have a leaky pipe, you don't often think, maybe if I change the composition of the water and fortify the drops, the pipe will stop leaking. No, on the contrary, you immediately assume the problem is with the pipe and try to determine which environmental factors have led to the corrosion of the pipe. Well, in academic medicine, our approach to the leaky pipeline has been traditionally to try to make the water better. We offer the drops of water, our learners and our junior faculty from historically underrepresented groups, supplemental instruction, wraparound mentorship, tools to build community, as if they are the problem, without ever investigating what is rotting and rusting the pipe in the first place. Now, if the pipeline is physically in the master's house, and the house is structural racism, what do you think is corroding the pipe? And when someone like Eleanor Equity, your star intern, travels through this pipe, if she becomes discouraged or is actively marginalized, is the problem with her, or is it with the system? Let's check in again on Eleanor, who is rounding with you and the hospitalist team on a 9-month-old child of Haitian immigrant parents. The patient has a history of trisomy 21 and VSD, congenital heart disease, but was hospitalized due to respiratory distress in the setting of viral bronchiolitis. Now, the patient is all better and can be discharged home. However, because of her heart disease, she has a new oxygen requirement and will have to go home on supplemental oxygen. During family-centered rounds, Eleanor explains this new requirement to the mother, and the mother, with a Haitian Creole accent, explains that she has a younger son at home with a seizure disorder and hyperactivity and bordering on defiant behavior, and she's really concerned about going home with an oxygen tank. She thinks he's going to interfere with it and put her other child's life in danger. She works evening shifts at a nursing home, and her husband works during the day, so she would need some help at home in order to make sure that her child is safe on oxygen. The team, led by Eleanor, leaves the bedside to find the case manager to discuss options for the family. The team figured with some visiting nurse services, they could really create a safe discharge plan. The case manager knew the case well, and in discussing potential discharge plans, blurts out to the entire team, "Well, I really hope this mom is on some kind of birth control. The last thing she needs is another child." The team all stopped and stared at the case manager, incredulous at what she had just said. Knowing the history of forced sterilization and medical experimentation on people of color, particularly immigrants, did she just suggest that this woman should stop having children? Would she have made the same comment if this woman were white? If she spoke English without an accent? What assumptions had she made during that brief encounter? And what deeply held beliefs fueled her to say such a thing? When the master's house is structural racism, everything that is built in that house, patient care and medical education, is impacted. Racism doesn't just reach the learners, it reaches the patients too. And generally, the impact on patients is even more profound. It is no secret that racism is a powerful driver of health inequity and probably one of the most, if not the most, influential social determinant of health. Its power comes in large part from its deep historical roots, which permit it to be broadly influential and profoundly insidious. We could spend the next several hours, perhaps even the next several days, just talking about how racism impacts health inequity. But instead, I'm going to rely on a simple yet precise summary of the impact racism has had on health outcomes in the United States, published in the New England Journal of Medicine last year by Zinzi Bailey and others. In the article, they distill down how structural racism in the United States has affected health outcomes of Americans in three important ways: residential discrimination, the criminal justice system, and unequal medical care. We'll start with residential discrimination. Home ownership, one of the most common ways to transfer wealth in the United States, has a deeply racist past. Redlining was the practice utilized by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency founded in the 1930s, to expand home ownership following the Great Depression. And what they did was determine which neighborhoods were worthy of receiving mortgage dollars. Neighborhoods considered high risk or hazardous were often redlined by lending institutions. And the term redline is not metaphorical. They literally took maps and drew giant red circles around Black neighborhoods and deemed them to be not worthy of capital investment. This, of course, led to banks not wanting to give mortgages to individuals who lived in these neighborhoods or who wanted to live in these neighborhoods. And for Black neighborhoods, really limited access to home ownership for Black families and limited the availability of intergenerational wealth transfer. This was all completely legal and sanctioned by the American government. Redlining officially ended with the Fair Housing Act in 1968, but so much of the damage had already been done. In neighborhoods that are redlined, we see enormous wealth, education, and health disparities for our children. In the United States, 32% of Black children, 31% of American Indian children, and 26% of Latinx children are living in poverty, versus 11% of white children. Disparities in access to education, as well as racism experienced by students in their educational environments, greatly impacts the educational trajectory for these children. We see disparities in high school graduation rates and chronic absenteeism from school, which disproportionately affect children of color and children living in poverty. According to the U.S. Department of Education, students from historically marginalized groups have less access to experienced teachers, advanced coursework, and resources. They are less likely to be identified for and receive special education services, and they are more likely to receive harsh punishments for behavioral transgressions. African American and American Indian children are overrepresented among children experiencing suspension. The United States Department of Education reports that African American children in grades K through 12 are suspended 3 times more and expelled 1.9 times more than white students. In certain states, school districts with more non-white children receive less funding at any given poverty level than districts with predominantly white children. As pediatricians, we understand how these educational disparities then impact health disparities. But there are health disparities that are linked directly to redlining. We see increased rates of preterm birth, maternal depression, asthma, and mental health concerns in neighborhoods that were once redlined. Black premature infants, already at high risk due to their prematurity, also have higher rates of morbidity secondary to bronchopulmonary dysplasia, intraventricular hemorrhage, and necrotizing enterocolitis when compared to white premature infants. This is in addition to the impact that poverty and poor education, both factors significantly influenced by home ownership, have globally on health inequity. Policing policy in the United States is also deeply embedded in historically racist roots. Police patrols were created largely to discourage slave rebellions and capture runaway slaves. After the abolition of slavery, Jim Crow laws were intended to push back any progress made during Reconstruction and reassert the dominance of whites over the formerly enslaved and their descendants. The role of policing in the criminal justice system was very specifically targeted to this end. Prisons and prison labor supplanted what was once slave labor through convict leasing, and the police often encouraged and participated in the terrorism of lynching. Following the Civil Rights Act, presidential declarations by Johnson of the war on crime and by Nixon of the war on drugs led to a 7-fold increase in the American prison population, with Black Americans being imprisoned at 5 times the rate of white Americans. The impact of mass incarceration, like housing, is both broad and deep. The formerly incarcerated face barriers to employment, public housing, federal cash assistance, student loans, food stamps, and voting. Children whose parents or caregivers are imprisoned suffer consequences from loss of income as well as loss of stability. They are at increased risk of depression, anxiety, PTSD, asthma, and migraines. When male adolescents are exposed to racial profiling, even in the absence of an actual arrest, the hostile trauma actually leads to anxiety. Children who witnessed violence suffer more from PTSD, substance abuse, depression, poor school performance, suspensions, and expulsions. And they are also more likely to have poor self-rated health. So redlining and residential segregation, as well as mass incarceration and police violence, are 2 examples of how structural racism impacts pediatric health outcomes. But you might argue that those impacts are not direct impacts. And so when we look at how racism is impacting pediatric health outcomes, we look at these 2 systems I've just outlined as being outside of pediatric medicine. But what if I told you there was plenty that was happening within pediatric medicine that also impacts these pediatric healthcare disparities? The US mortality rate for Black infants remains over 2 times the rate of that for white infants. Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander and American Indian infants also suffer from mortality rates far higher than the national average. But when we stop to look at the care that Black infants receive during their NICU stay, care that we provide them as healthcare providers in our pediatric institutions, it's really quite different than their white counterparts, due in large part to personally mediated racism. Data demonstrates that Black premature infants are less likely to be offered donor breast milk and follow-up referrals while in the NICU. Black and Latinx mothers reported more experiences of bias in the NICU than white and Asian mothers. And importantly, perceived racism was significantly associated with preterm birth among women with mild to moderate depressive symptoms. Additionally, infants born to Black mothers were more likely than those born to white mothers to have drug screening performed, whether or not they met screening criteria, even when controlled for income, insurance status, and medical education and maternal education. We see disparities in insulin pump use in African American and Latinx children as well, likely connected to caregiver perceptions of cost and provider perceptions of family competence. The result is that Latinx and African American children had higher mean hemoglobin A1C levels, and more Black children suffered from DKA and severe hypoglycemic events when compared to white or Latinx children. Black children experience a 2-fold greater risk of death due to type 1 diabetes mellitus compared to white children, even though the incidence and prevalence of type 1 diabetes is actually greater among white children. When mental health conditions are considered, Latinx and Black children are less likely to receive treatment than white children and less likely to receive effective evidence-based mental health care. Non-white children were 2 times less likely to receive appropriate pharmacotherapy, and Latinx children with limited English proficiency were more likely to be hospitalized for acute management of mental health disorders. Black children and adolescents are more likely to be diagnosed with psychosis or behavioral disorders, and Latinx youth were also more likely to be diagnosed with disruptive behavioral disorders. This when compared to white children and adolescents who are more often diagnosed with mood disorders like anxiety and depression. Black and Latinx children with abdominal pain are less likely to undergo imaging. Black and low-income children also had increased odds of perforated appendicitis, intensive care admissions, and longer lengths of stay. In children with confirmed appendicitis, Black children were less likely to receive any pain medication for moderate pain and less likely to receive opioids for severe pain. So when we look at all of these different contributors to health disparities, whether it be housing discrimination, the police, the criminal justice system, or our system of medicine itself, we begin to understand just how impactful racism can be. And in thinking about what's happening with our intern, Eleanor, and processing some of the data that I just shared with you about so many disparities in pediatric health outcomes, what we realize is that racism is fueling disparities educationally, professionally, and clinically for so many individuals who are marginalized. And so you begin to see a picture of how racism is working in our daily spaces. But that's really just the exterior of the house. The veranda, the pillars, the shutters, all of that is the racism that we can see every day. But racism is much more than what we see. In order to dismantle this house, we have to recognize how it's constructed, the bones. The bones of the house represent how racism is structured, and we have to understand that as well. Academic medicine, just like any large institution, is subject to the impact of racism and oppression. To ignore that fact is to disregard a critical component of creating equitable learning, clinical learning environments for our patients, our learners, and our colleagues. The video I'm going to play is a simple representation of just how 4 levels of oppression work together to marginalize people based on race, ethnicity, gender, gender expression, religion, ability, you name it. It reminds us all that 4 levels of oppression are working all at the same time and feeding off of each other. So we have to be really intentional about disrupting these cycles if we hope to see change.
Oppression. It's a word that's often used as a blanket term, but there's actually a whole lot more to it. There are 4 interlocking aspects of oppression: ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. And it might seem like a small difference, but it's very important to be able to distinguish between each kind, because understanding oppression is the first step to fighting it. Let's start with the core at the heart of every form of oppression: ideology. Every system of oppression comes from the idea that one group is somehow better than another. Ideological oppression starts when the dominant group associates positive qualities with itself and negative qualities with the marginalized or othered group. Ideological oppression describes the deeply ingrained social root of inequality. It's the larger overarching idea that leads to the isms. For example, the idea that black people are dangerous is ideological racism. The idea that poor people are lazy is ideological classism. Ideological oppression leads to institutional oppression. Institutional oppression is the way that systems and institutions manifest the dominant ideology. Institutions control access, who is able to get to what and how. This includes legal rights, police practice, access to medical care and education, public policy, political power, and media representation. For example, when women make 2/3 of what men make, that's institutional sexism. When a building is constructed without wheelchair ramps, that's institutional ableism. All of this leads to interpersonal oppression. Interpersonal oppression is probably the easiest to recognize because it happens all around us. Interpersonal oppression is the way that people play out discrimination and violence on each other. It can take the form of microaggressions, jokes, stereotypes, and harassment. For example, when a student is bullied for being gay, it's interpersonal homophobia. When a Muslim person is told that they're a terrorist, it's interpersonal Islamophobia. And all those forces, ideological, institutional, and interpersonal, lead to internalized oppression. Internalized oppression is the way that people with marginalized identities internalize narratives of their own inferiority. It's what leads people to feel less than. This is the end goal of oppression. The oppressive party doesn't need to exert force any longer because the marginalized group is enacting oppression on itself to maintain the status quo. It's important to remember that it's never a marginalized person's fault that they feel internalized oppression. It's simply what happens when someone faces negative stereotypes, low expectations, and ongoing discrimination. So, for example, an immigrant feeling embarrassed about having an accent is internalized xenophobia. When a trans woman feels that they can never be a real woman, that's internalized transphobia. So, to review, the 4 I's of oppression are ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. Each of these types are interconnected and completely supported by the others. They can never exist on their own and can even be seen as a cycle. Now that you understand the different kinds of oppression, you're even more equipped to fight it. Don't forget that any effort to dismantle oppression should aim to address it at all 4 of these levels. Thanks for watching.
So I think one of the most important parts of that representation of the 4 I's of oppression is just how well they feed off of each other. So interpersonal racism, racism that one person has towards another group, doesn't really become activated until it interacts with institutional and ideological racism. Our interpersonal racism helps to uphold institutional and ideological, as well as internalized racism, which facilitates oppression. Importantly, the legitimacy of institutional racism involves perceptions that a particular policy is fair, deserved, or justifiable. And I'm going to repeat that because it's really important. And this is really how racism continues to do its work. The legitimacy of institutional racism involves perceptions that a particular policy is fair, deserved, or justifiable, which means that if you're not actively searching for bias and racism in your policies, they will go unnoticed or unchecked because the perception is that they're completely fair. And importantly, the unequal outcomes created by institutional racism help to reinforce the interpersonal, internalized, and ideological racism. So we find ourselves in a vicious cycle. And I'll use this an example within academic medicine to make it really clear how each of these types of oppression work off of each other. Now, imagine you're a chair of a department. And as chair, you have a new individual who is from a historically underrepresented group joining your faculty. Your impression as chair is that any junior faculty who is underrepresented would be really excited to start a diversity committee within your department. And this is something that you've needed for a really long time, so you assign this junior faculty member the diversity committee without asking them. The junior faculty member, of course, takes on this responsibility. They want to demonstrate that they are a responsible member of the department and really starts to put in a ton of effort into this enterprise. The problem is that the committee has no resources. The junior faculty doesn't understand that no matter how much work they put into this committee, the fact that the department chair has not put any resources towards it has really doomed it for failure. But the fact that the committee has no resources is really an example of ideological oppression, because in the chair's mind, well, what does a committee on diversity need resources for anyway? You guys just get together and you talk about stuff. Nothing is actually going to get done. So this junior faculty member really pours so much effort into this and is only getting so far, but doesn't have mentorship from another underrepresented senior faculty member to tell them, this is a losing game. You need to go back to the chair and ask for some real resources to get anything done. The fact that they have a lack of mentorship is a demonstration of institutional oppression. There are no senior faculty members who are underrepresented. This junior faculty member is one of one within the department. And so, of course, as the junior faculty member continues to try to do work for this diversity committee, they leave behind some of the other responsibilities that they have as a member of an academic department. They're not able to pursue other scholarly pursuits or interests that they would normally have done if not for the fact that they were trying to push this diversity committee forward. So when it comes time to review the junior faculty member, their division director is really disappointed. They look at their work and they say, well, you haven't published anything. What are you working on? And this is another example of institutional oppression, because at the institution, no one is valuing the work that this junior faculty member is doing. We have deemed the DEI work not to be worthy of scholarly pursuit or of scholarly recognition. So despite the fact that the faculty member is putting a ton of time into this, they're not getting recognized for it. And that undervaluing of work puts the faculty member really at a disadvantage. So their division director tells them, well, because you're really not keeping up with your timeline for promotion, we're going to change you and put you on a different track. And so now the faculty member starts to think, well, gosh, if I'm not even able to keep up with the academic rigor of an academic institution, do I even belong in academic medicine? This is where internalized racism begins to play an enormous role. And at the end of all of this, the chair, looking at the fact that this faculty member has had to switch to another track, tells him or herself, well, I guess underrepresented faculty are just not interested in rigorous or scholarly work. Because when I look at all of the individuals who have been promoted on the scholarly track, none of them are underrepresented. I guess it's just not something that individuals of color are interested in. Now that just reinforces the interpersonal bias that department chair had in the first place, because now they've decided that this is just not a natural interest for people of color, so the next time there is a role to play that is not scholarly, they will then assign another member from a historically underrepresented group. And this is how all of the cycles play off of each other to continue the system of oppression. Now, if someone does not look really systematically at this system of promotions and tenure, everyone will make assumptions about who wants to be a part of the scholarly work and who doesn't want to be a part of the scholarly work. But if someone takes the time to see that there are real disparities in who is being promoted, how they're being promoted, who is a professor within the department, who is at the assistant professor level, who's had to receive extensions on their promotions clock, if someone is really asking those questions, that's the only time that they will start to see that there are real systems of oppression that are at play here. Now, how are Eleanor and her team faring? When we left them, their case manager had just implied that a Black immigrant mother should stop having children because the family needed some additional support. The team all stopped and looked at the case manager, absorbing what she had just said. The attending finally turns to the case manager and breaks the silence and says, yeah, the responsibility of having children is daunting. As a woman, I can totally relate to the importance of family planning. The senior resident on the team adds, I can't imagine she would want more kids. I mean, 2 children with chronic illness is already such a handful. The remainder of the team quietly nods in approval. Later during noon conference, Eleanor excuses herself to go to the bathroom. She's still so upset about what's happened earlier on rounds, but really feels helpless. She can't believe that the entire team agreed with the case manager's racist statement, and no one said anything to her about how inappropriate it was. In the end, the family didn't receive the care that they needed, and no one even noticed. Could she bring this to her advisor? Would they understand? She made this decision to come to a program where there was less representation. Was this a bad decision for her? Who could she possibly talk to about this concern that she was having? There was no way that she was going to stay here for fellowship. She was Black. She was also born of immigrant parents with accents. What on earth did her colleagues think about her if that's what they thought about the mother that they just saw? And how were they being trained to care for patients of color? So we've seen the exterior of the master's house and how racism presents in our clinical learning environment, and I've explained the structure of racism, the bones, so to speak. But what if I told you that's still not enough? That understanding the exterior and the bones is simply not going to get us there. What about the foundation of the master's house? A foundation is meant to undergird the entire structure. And if we don't interrogate and understand the foundation, how successful are we going to be at bringing the structure down? What if I told you the very foundation of medicine and medical education is racist? And without that fundamental acknowledgement and understanding, we cannot move forward. I'm going to talk a little bit about a term called epistemic injustice. And this is a term coined by philosopher Miranda Fricker, meant to reflect injustice in who is seen as a knower or knowledgeable. According to Fricker, there are two types of epistemic injustice: testimonial and hermeneutical. In testimonial injustice, someone's role as a knower is devalued or not given credibility because of prejudice against how the person self-identifies. This can happen due to gender, race, socioeconomic status, ethnicity. So an example of this might be a Black patient with sickle cell disease reporting persistent pain following a dose of a narcotic. But that patient is ignored by the doctor because the doctor knows that the dose is sufficient to treat the pain. Another example of this is a gender nonconforming student on rounds who answers a question posed by the attending only to have the attending ask the male student to confirm the validity of the answer. These are two examples of testimonial injustice. Hermeneutical injustice is when, due to the inherent nature of a structure, an individual cannot make sense of an experience that they are having. This type of injustice is often spoken about colloquially as the system was not built for us being individuals who are marginalized. An example of this would be students of color experiencing what we now refer to as microaggressions before the term was popularized. Now, I did my training a very long time ago, and we didn't have a term of microaggressions, but in retrospect, I completely remember experiencing microaggressions. However, because there wasn't a term to talk about it, I had no way to express it. I had no way to tell people that this was my experience. And not only didn't I have a way to express that or communicate that, there was no way I could hold people accountable for the microaggressions, because what were they anyway? What was this experience that I was having of people saying things that were making me feel marginalized, but were not statements of overt racism or sexism or gender discrimination? And so in this way, hermeneutical injustice allows for a dismissal of the experience of people who are marginalized and a lack of accountability for those experiences. Now, in both examples of epistemic injustice, when we examine who is the de facto knower, or which system is considered the objectively accurate system, the answer is always the system that was created by white, cisgendered, straight males. The question really remains then, how do we define knowledge, mastery, and competence? Sociologists and philosophers, in examining colonialism and structural discrimination, have asked themselves this exact same question, and many have settled on the notion that the very way we think, learn, understand the world is embedded in this concept of epistemic injustice. Not surprisingly, this applies to health professions education and medical education in particular. The authors of this paper state very clearly that health professions education programs and the evidence that we use to build them are so embedded within this perspective that how the health system has been constructed appears to be natural. Again, that understanding or that contemplation that a system that we have is legitimate, so it stops us from questioning the very basis of that system. We posit that it is through this very system that we have been conditioned not to question why we think we know what we know, or why we think ideas are core to curriculum while others are not. This picture here is a picture of Abraham Flexner, who is considered to be the father of modern medical education. In 1910, he published a seminal report on the state of medical education in the United States for the Carnegie Foundation. In order to gather data for his report, from 1908 to 1910, he visited 155 medical schools across the United States and Canada, and his report was scathing. He examined entrance requirements, faculty-to-student ratios, financing, library facilities, laboratory instruction, and access to teaching hospital and clinical mentors. And based on the examination of these factors, he recommended the closure of many medical schools, including 7 of the 9 medical schools that educated African American students. Following the Supreme Court ruling on Plessy v. Ferguson just 20 years prior, which completely codified separate but equal, Flexner's decision severely restricted the production of Black physicians for generations to come. It's also important to understand the factors that Flexner chose to focus on. He chose financing, access to teaching hospitals, laboratory instruction, not community impact, not patient outcomes or patient trust, something that historically Black medical schools were doing a fantastic job of. But because he chose these very specific factors, it facilitated the closure of the majority of Black medical schools that were open and serving patients of color at that time. What is interesting about this is that many of the factors that he chose back in the early 1900s are still factors that we use decades later. When you look at the U.S. News and World Report, which is one of the ways that medical schools and academic institutions are rated, many of the same factors continue to be pervasive in that reporting system and still get to dictate which schools get money, fame, and resources. So if you don't know that the foundation of medical education is racist, if you don't understand how these systems are built, there's no way that you can dismantle it. And this is actually hot off the presses. This was published in JAMA just yesterday. And it's a fantastic opinion piece by two individuals who work for the Josiah Macy Foundation, Holly Humphrey and Dana Levinson. And they have been vocal critics of the U.S. News and World Report ranking system. And in this essay, they make very clear that right now, the way we are rating medical schools and the way that we are admitting medical students, 25% of all of our medical students come from families whose income is in the nation's top 5%. Can you imagine? And we sit around and lament about the fact that our medical students and our physicians are not representative of our patients. Well, this is whom we're allowing into our medical schools. This is who we've decided deserve our education and our resources. In the essay, they go on to say that Meharry and Morehouse medical schools, two schools that are historically Black, ultimately found themselves unwilling to sacrifice core tenets of their mission to play the rankings game. The way that these schools choose to assess the quality of the medical education that they provide and the excellence of the future physicians who come into their learning environments is completely disconnected from the marketplace that U.S. News and World Report has created. As you can tell, Meharry and Morehouse are two of the many schools that have pulled out of the rankings. But this is just an example. Here we are in 2023, still fighting the structures that get to rate and determine the best types of medical schools that are in our society. Again, if we're not examining the foundation of where these structures come from, we simply cannot dismantle how oppressive they are. And so self-reflection is going to be an important part of this. First and foremost, those of us in academic medicine, and I include myself in this group, have to admit complicity in keeping these structures standing. We have to call out fallacies of the current system. We have to believe the outcomes. When we see disparities in medical education and see disparities in healthcare and healthcare outcomes, we have to stop making excuses for them. These disparities come from something, and we have to identify what that something is. And we have to assert a new system that doesn't erase the accomplishments of our previous generation, that continues to celebrate them, but also creates space to celebrate and include different types of learners and different types of physicians and providers. Now, what could happen in this situation where the case manager had just implied that a Black immigrant mother should stop having children because the family needed some additional support? Imagine if this had gone entirely a different way. In an attempt to address the awkward silence, the attending turned to the case manager and said, "May I have a brief word with you?" and took her aside. They spoke privately for several minutes, and the attending returned to the team. Upon her return, she addressed the team and she said, "That was an example of implicit bias and how it can negatively impact patient care. The case manager has some biased beliefs about this family, likely because they are Black, immigrant, and speak with a foreign accent. She was not focused on providing the best care for this child, just on addressing the concerns that she has personally based on her biased beliefs. I just spoke with her about that statement and discussed the potential negative impact of bias. Let's continue rounds and debrief this afternoon on how that encounter made everyone feel. I'll also discuss with the nurse manager and our program director to see what we can do to better educate our staff." Now, this is a great example of a culture that is systematic about combating inequity and bias. Although the system allows for individuals to express opinions and provide care that is tarnished by bias, appropriate training of the faculty and the presence of diverse backgrounds and perspectives enables culture change and for individuals of diverse backgrounds to feel supported. In this instance, Eleanor feels respected. She feels supported, and she feels that her own mission and values actually align with the mission and values of the institution. And in that way, she can actually see a future of remaining within the institution and really staying on to do fellowship and perhaps remaining on as a faculty member. In order to interrupt these vicious cycles, we need to activate ourselves as agents of change. Now, I know you've heard the term ally before, but I'm going to utilize it here and actually push everyone in the audience to move beyond being an ally. Now, the definition of an ally is really the definition of, or the definition of an ally is one of a disruptor, an educator in spaces dominated by whiteness. And typically, we consider being an ally a verb. One needs to act like an ally. The actions of an ally have the greater likelihood to challenge institutional racism and white supremacy. The challenge in academic medicine is that although many people believe they are allies, in reality they're stuck in the role of actor. The actions of an actor actually do not disrupt the status quo. They do not explicitly name or challenge the pillars of white supremacy, which is necessary for meaningful progress towards racial justice. And I would say that instead of just pushing ourselves from going to actors to allies, I would ask everyone here to be an accomplice. The actions of an accomplice are actually meant to directly challenge institutionalized racism, colonization, and white supremacy by blocking or impeding racist people, policies, and structures. Individuals who are accomplices are not motivated by personal guilt or shame, and they are not emotionally fragile. They realize that our freedoms and liberations are bound together, and that retreat or withdrawal in the face of oppressive structures simply is not an option. And so here is a list of targeted interventions that I know that we are capable in academic medicine of undertaking. This is a list of what I like to call the master's tools. We do this stuff all the time. We review grade distribution and clerkships. We look at resident recruitment and retention. We also look at faculty recruitment and retention and try to assess our curriculum to see if it's innovative enough. We participate in community engagement, and we absolutely do QI efforts. But are any of these done through the lens of someone or an institution that is anti-racist? Are you looking at those student grade distributions to see if there are any distinctions between those individuals who are students of color or marginalized and those who aren't? And when you see those differences, what are you doing about them? When you're looking at resident recruitment and faculty recruitment and retention, are you actually collecting data on how many individuals who are underrepresented are recruited and then stay? Do they stay for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? Are you performing exit interviews with these individuals to ask them, why are you leaving? This is data that is at our fingertips that we can actually collect and then utilize to make impactful change. When you are assessing curriculum, are you assessing it for inclusivity? Is that one of the metrics to make sure that a curriculum gets to stay in your undergraduate medical education program or in your graduate medical education program? Are your community engagement efforts community-centered? Do you ask the community on a regular basis, is this what you want us to do? Is this meaningful to you? Are the outcomes of this community engagement actually outcomes that are interesting and a part of your goals as a community? And when you're measuring healthcare disparities among your patients, are you measuring the actual impact of discrimination and oppression and how those systems impact healthcare disparities? Or are you just looking at the healthcare disparities and presuming that it has to do with the patients and not the structures that support the patients? As a department, do you recognize and value DEI work? On your promotions and tenure, in your promotions and tenure committees, is there a requirement that faculty members actually have demonstrable DEI efforts as part of their CV? And do those individuals who are already participating in those efforts, do they get credit for when they're being promoted? When you look at your departmental leadership, how diverse is it? This should not be a difficult question to ask. If it's not representative of the patients you care for, then you're doing something wrong. Do you have a system to actually report microaggressions, and what happens when they're reported? How is that information fed back to the individuals who are doing the reporting? And what specific interventions do you make? Is it education? Is it policy change? What are you doing to actually decrease the number of microaggressions? And lastly, do you have policies on anti-discrimination so that families and patients can't discriminate against the physicians and the students and learners who are in your system? And when you're making all of these interventions, how are you assessing their outcomes? How are you making sure that you are meeting the mark? And how often do you assess the outcomes and make changes in relation to those outcomes? Curricular interventions are probably one of the easiest ways as medical educators we can make a true impact, but we have to make sure that we are doing them. We have to make sure that we are including structural competency, a framework that was designed by Jonathan Metzl and Helena Hansen, two psychiatrists who are at Vanderbilt and now at UCLA. Structural competency is a shift in medical education to focus our attention on attaining competency in our understanding of structures that cause disparate outcomes for our patients. So no longer do we talk about cultural competency or what is it about the patient that leads them to this health outcome. The idea is to teach all of our learners about the structures. How do the structures actually impact the health outcomes of our patients? And how can we make sure that we are competent in these structures? One of the other new frameworks or newer frameworks that has been introduced in pediatrics is competency-based medical education. And you'll see that entrustable professional activities are a big way, or one of the systems that we use to actually assess our pediatric learners. I had an opportunity to work with a fantastic pediatrician at Cincinnati Children's, Ndidi Unaka, who actually led a small working group so that we could rewrite the entrustable professional activity 14 that the board provides us to assess our learners and our faculty members. And in the rewrite of the EPA, we explicitly address racism. So now it is an expectation that the American board has put out that physicians that are graduating from our GME programs really have a competency and an understanding of what racism is and how it impacts patients. And if you look at EPA 14, there's an entire framework for how you teach this work and how you assess this work. This is how we make our tools that were once tools of oppression really tools of disruption in order to take down structural racism and its impact on pediatric care and medical education. So in summary, racism impacts our entire clinical learning environment. We might think about our learning environment in separate pieces, but once there is a structure that is impacting one group of individuals, it's impacting all of them. So you're going to have impacts on your learners, on your faculty, as well as on your patients. Individual, institutional, internalized, and ideological racism all work together in concert, and they really fuel health, learner, and professional disparities. You all have the power to be accomplices. You just need to pay attention to those systems that lead to disparate outcomes and make a commitment to dismantling them. And certainly there are targeted interventions that everyone in this room can take, from residents to faculty members to departmental leaders. It's just important that those efforts are collaborative, because you can't take down just one part of the system at a time. You have to focus on all of them. Thank you all so much for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Just make sure you hold it right under your mouth.
Was that? Yeah. Thank you for the wonderful talk. Clearly, we have institutional inequities. The issue I have is words matter, right? So when we use the word racism, that means it's intentional. And all these behaviors, it may not be intentional, but unconscious biases, okay? So therefore, when we use racism, I have issue with that, because that implies that you intentionally sort of oppress somebody. But some of us, we all have it, right? We all have unconscious biases. Even, for example, in my world, when we interview surgical residency, when they graduate from foreign and not a U.S. graduate, we somehow already sort of put a label on them. They don't have X, Y, and Z as we expect. That's implicit biases. This is not racism. And so I think the term may turn off a lot of people. What's your thought?
Well, thank you so much for that question. I'm going to challenge you just a little bit because there's no implication in the term racism that there is intentionality there. And what I think I'm hearing from you is the specific call out of interpersonal racism. But really, racism is structural. Racism is something that is embedded in all of these structures. And it doesn't have to be intentional in order for it to be impactful. I think our desire to make people feel comfortable and not turn people off stops us from doing important work. We have spent a long time avoiding the term racism because we are concerned that it's going to turn people off. But in all of this time, we have not made progress. In order for us to really deal with something, we have to name it what it is. The word cancer is very scary to a lot of people, but you would never advise a patient who's just been diagnosed with cancer without using the term cancer. You have to call it out in order to treat that patient, whether it's surgically or whether it's medically. Racism is exactly the same thing. It is a scary term, but we have to utilize the term, we have to define it, we have to get comfortable with it, because we are certainly living with the impact of racism, and the impact of racism is terrible. So what is more uncomfortable? Continuing to live with the impact of racism on our patients and on our learners and on our institutions, or simply defining the word, putting it out there, and then making a concerted effort and a real commitment to dismantling it. I would argue that living with it, at least for me, has been way more uncomfortable than saying it.
Other questions? Hold it right under your mouth.
Thank you so much for that amazing talk. Really nice. What has been your own experience with some of the solutions that you offer at Brown University since you've become the Senior Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion?
You know, I think one of the most impactful changes that we made policy-wise was actually in our promotions and tenure committee. And so right now we have a requirement that in order to be promoted, in order to receive a faculty appointment, faculty members have to have demonstrable work in DEI. And that might mean working on recruitment of diverse applicants, that might be working on curriculum, that might be mentorship of diverse learners, but there has to be something tangible and important that individuals are doing to even be considered for faculty appointment. And one of the metrics for promotions is that DEI work. So individuals who are already doing that work, who've been doing that work for years that have not been recognized, now can utilize that as part of one of the reasons why they should be promoted. It reinforces what we say is important to us. If we say that diversity, equity, and inclusion is important, then when an individual wants to move from associate professor to professor, we have to show that that is actually something that's important to us. And so we do give individuals credit for that. And that's been a change that's happened in the last 2 years, and it's had a significant impact on individuals of color getting promoted, but also, again, an enormous statement to all of us within the community that this is really important to our institution.
I have a question. You mentioned on your interventions, microaggression reporting. What does that look like in your organization, and what happens after the report?
That's a great question. So we have different levels of microaggressions reporting because, as you can imagine, individuals who are experiencing microaggressions might need different ways to bring these concerns up. So at a hospital level, we have one giant reporting system that is kind of like, we call it safety net. It's basically our system for reporting any errors or challenges within the hospital system. So if you have dosed, a medication dose was inappropriate or some other larger systems issue happened, you would report it through safety net. We say microaggressions are at exactly the same level. If you've experienced a microaggression or you've witnessed a microaggression, you can report it into safety net, and our chief diversity officer receives all of those reports and addresses them. Some individuals don't like the idea of reporting at that level. They want something that's a little bit more local. So the departments and the residency program actually have separate microaggressions reporting systems. And the one at the residency level is as basic as you can get. It is a Google form that all of our residents have a QR code for. And when they see a microaggression or when they experience one, they can type it in. It can be anonymous. They can put their name in. And the program director is responsible for giving feedback to the resident in regards to what's happened with that microaggression. And the department has something very similar. And so the department is able then to sort of collect the number of microaggressions and where the microaggressions are happening to have an understanding, is this just something that's a one-off that happened in a particular department or in a particular unit? Or is there a unit that has a real systemic problem that we need to address? Oftentimes it's the latter, and you can actually look at patterns within the department of where those units are that need a little bit of extra help. What we're working on now is helping to bring together the reporting system at the higher hospital level with the reporting system in the individual departments, because we think if we can collaborate across those reports, again, it just gives us another opportunity to re-examine and reevaluate what we're doing institutionally, and also to engage some of the resources of the Chief Diversity Officer. So we're still thinking and rethinking of ways to make this data actionable, and I think it's worked enormously well. With at the residency level, we started I'm no longer the program director, but we started that system when I was the program director, and we collected an enormous amount of data, and there was definitely a problem with one unit at one hospital, and that data allowed us to go to the COO and the CEO of the hospital and say, this particular unit really has problems. We engaged the HR manager because a lot of the microaggressions were happening actually, they were coming from many of our nursing staff and many other members in departments that we were not responsible for as physicians. So we had to engage HR, we had to engage the hiring process, the nurse educators, so that they could really speak to those nurses that were involved in the microaggressions. But in the absence of that data, none of that would have happened.
We have time for one more question.
Sort of in a similar vein to that. So I am an advisor to several residents, and I've had residents that have reported microaggressions through a similar reporting system that we have here. Once I've helped kind of facilitate them, make sure that they've been reported correctly and all of that, and that sort of is already in motion, how else can I support that resident during that time other than just making sure the reporting has occurred?
That is such a great question, and a part of this process that is often forgotten. I think we like to, where many of us are physicians, some of us are educators, and what we like to do is fix things. We like to teach something, make sure that our students and our learners have it, make sure that our patients are cared for, and wrap it up and call it quits. But follow up with the learner that has experienced that microaggression is key. I think probably the most important part of that interaction is to acknowledge that what the learner is experiencing is real and unfortunate. I think it's actually the first thing I always say when I hear a report of a microaggression. First thing I say is, that is terrible that you experienced it, and it is very, very real, and I hear you and I see you. It sounds silly, but it is so critically important. Because again, as I shared, when I was a trainee and didn't know what a microaggression was, I experienced all of that without ever being able to articulate it. And it is terribly damning to someone who is trying to make it through medical education. So that recognition that what they're experiencing is real and wrong, I think is critically important. And then just following up and checking in and saying, how are things going? Has that happened again to you? Do you need any additional help? I think just that follow-up check-in, even in a month's time, is really, really important, because as you can imagine, as learners, oftentimes when our students and our trainees are in difficult situations, they kind of suppress all of that to continue moving forward. And I think all of us who are physicians know this feeling where you experience something pretty terrible and traumatic and you pretend like it hasn't happened because you have to still see patients, you have to take your in-training exam, you have a bunch of stuff to do. Who has time to process feelings? What happens then is those feelings pop up later at some point because they're not going away. I've learned that. And so checking in with them periodically afterwards to see where they are in that processing. You know, some people that'll happen within a couple of days, some people that'll happen within several months. For some learners, I know it doesn't happen for years. And they come back and they say, you know, I had this horrible experience and it made me feel terrible. It made me feel like I didn't belong here. And I've never really spoken to anybody about it. So just that constant check-in is important. I often will engage the advisors in the conversation to let them know, oh, this resident had a challenge, had a microaggression, we've dealt with it, but please continue to check in with them. And I have the chief residents check in with them as well, just so they know that we're still interested in that impact and we know that that impact might come out at any point, but that we're still here to listen.
Thank you. As a psychologist, I will reinforce 1,000% the importance of processing feelings, because if you don't, they will come out somewhere else. Thank you so much. Yes, please join me in thanking Dr. Poitevin for a wonderful presentation. Very, very important. I want to thank you for giving us insight, not just into the structures that we have that perpetuate some of these difficulties, but also telling us how to change it on a personal level, on a professional level. So thank you, Dr. Poitevin, that was wonderful. And I sure hope that your disruption is contagious and long-lasting. And I will also say that I know there are two grannies who are quite proud of you and your work and what you've presented today. So thank you very much. As Dr. Poitevin has so well articulated and supported, structures within education must be challenged to change. Let's hear now from our Long Beach Unified School District about our Long Beach Unified School District's efforts to dismantle racism in education. Our speakers, and you all can come forward if you wish, are Dr. Tiffany Brown, Lachelle Diggs, and Sharon Barker. That I could speak forever about who they are, but I know you want to hear what they have to say, so I'm just going to give you a thumbnails version. Dr. Tiffany Brown, who is approaching the podium, is Deputy Superintendent of the Long Beach Unified School District, and she has worked for the district for 27 years. She has held numerous positions. In each position, a central role in Dr. Brown's work has been the belief that applying an equity lens to decisions allows for groups that are traditionally not acknowledged to have full voice and access to opportunities. In the role of Deputy Superintendent, Dr. Brown has continued her focus on equity by engaging youth, community groups, and district staff around the belief that equity should be the core of all we do. She'll be followed by two other speakers, Lachelle Diggs, who is the director of LBUSD Head Start, has been with Long Beach Unified School District for 31 years. Obviously, these women started at a very young age, very precocious women, where she has served as a teacher, a math coach, a program specialist, a vice principal, a principal, and a principal coach. She is passionate about helping children reach their highest potential by ensuring they receive a quality education in a safe and nurturing environment. She strives to ensure that equitable practices are part of all that Head Start does. Her favorite quote, love that you have a favorite quote, is from Nelson Mandela, and it is, "Education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world." And following is Sharon Barker. Sharon Barker is Program Specialist, Head Start, Birth to 3 School Readiness. She has been with the Long Beach Unified School District since 2006 as a teacher in multiple grade levels at various schools, including a special assignment at Buffum Total Learning Center and as a mentoring supervisor. She has supported learning in special education, general education, and gifted education Ms. Barker believes in the importance of educating the educator and has been integral in the creation of curricula and classrooms which are age and developmentally appropriate. She is passionate, self-reflective as an educator, and she has the skills to ensure an equitable and collaborative earning environment for students and teachers.
So on behalf of Long Beach Unified, and just with full recognition and admiration of Dr. Katherine White, who is absolutely present in the room today and was an equity warrior before equity was something we were talking about all the time, something that means very deeply to me and to the work of our school district, is that when we talk about equity, we're talking about voicing for the voiceless, and we're talking about challenging systems in ways where we begin to ask the questions that have never been asked before. And so I always know that we're on to something that's important if we are focusing on what we've never done before. Because what I know is that what we've always done has privileged some and has harmed others. So thank you so much. I'm deeply appreciative of being here. So who we are in Long Beach Unified School District just feels important to set the stage a little bit, and these are kind of the high-level topics that I'll be sharing, and I'm going to make up a little time for us, Dr. Martin, this morning as well. I look forward to sharing some bits of our equity journey and then some of the work that we've done around creating an excellence and equity policy, which again is right on point in the message of the morning around looking at the policies that affect the structures and therefore the practices and goals and the experience that happens within the organization. And then I'm just going to briefly highlight some of the work we're doing around equity, leadership, and talent development, and that's really our recruitment model. So who are we? We have about 65,000 students in our school district. We service Long Beach, Signal Hill, Lakewood, and Avalon. Avalon is an island that's 26 miles away where we have a K-12 school with 600 students. So that's something that's really unique to Long Beach. Like many districts in the area and across the country, we've experienced significant decline in enrollment. So I began in the district in 1997. I was 3, as Dr. Martin suggested. At that time, we had about 98,000 students in the school district, and we saw a peak in the early 2000s, and we've seen about a 3% decline every year since. So that's something that's noteworthy. We support 84 schools to include a really comprehensive early learning program that you'll hear from 2 of our awesome leaders from shortly in that work. We also support a transition program which serves students 18 to 22 with disabilities who are continuing their education with us, as well as a school for adults. So we are a busy place. A lot happens every day in our system, and many, many things go well. And in other areas, we have a whole lot of work to do. So I'm going to share with you some of the work that we have really been striving to do. And that work begins in this timeline. So this is a timeline in the creation of our excellence and equity policy. And this work really began July of 2020. So just kind of to orient us to what was happening at that time, it was March 13th of 2020 that we made the announcement that we were closing our schools due to the pandemic. What followed was a story the likes of which none of us could have ever written, and has really had such tremendous impact in every city across the country, and certainly in Long Beach Unified School District. And so it was in July 20th of that year, post the murder of George Floyd and an expression of civil unrest that we hadn't seen in quite some time, that our school board made the determination that we were going to create an equity leadership team. And the purpose in doing that was really to bring a group of community stakeholders together to involve community in the process of creating policy. And so again, to the words you've shared, really this idea of not about us, without us, and recognizing that as a system that is structured upon all of the components of oppression that have been highlighted this morning, We really have recognized that without the lived experience of our community, we will continue to make the same mistakes, because those mistakes have privileged and allowed comfort for the majority and have continued to harm many, many students. And if I can just describe briefly the demographic of our system, we have about 13% African American, Black students, about 12% white, about 60% Hispanic or Latinx, and the rest is made up of a group of Asian Pacific Islander groups, the majority of which are Cambodian. We have more Cambodian citizens living in the city of Long Beach than anywhere but Cambodia. So that's an important, and I hope understood statistic in our city, but just some context. So it was at that July 20th board meeting that our board said, we need the creation of this team. November of 2020, we put out an application, and that application said, interested people who want to participate in the creation of an excellence and equity policy, come forward. During the course of a weekend, I received 250 applications, and it blew my mind. In fact, I called it good trouble, because I didn't expect that much outreach, and then all of a sudden I went into how do we select, and what do we do with those who are very well-intentioned and have a lot to contribute, but we can't select a group of 250 people to write a policy. So it's continued really positive engagement with all those who applied, but we identified a core group of 30 people. And in January of 2021, we began this process of writing the equity policy, literally from the ground up. We looked at documents in other school districts. We wrote down core values that we absolutely must see incorporated in a document. And we just, through about 37 different iterations and over the course of the next year, we crafted a policy, the likes of which does not exist in the state of California, and that we are really, really proud of. It's a bold policy, and it charges forward for us a lot of work that feels like the most important and the absolute right work. I don't even like to refer to it as hard work, because hard work somehow implies that it's also not right. And it's such right work for us. So our board passed this policy in December of 2021, and that has put us on a path to a whole lot of important work. I've shared the community stakeholder voice that was really, really critical, could not have done it without. And if we ever tried, and I think this is really important for institutions, if we ever tried to write a policy like this without community voice, we would miss and continue to harm. We would completely miss and continue to harm. And so the voice, the lived experience of our parents, of students who participated, of staff who have had experiences that are hard to talk about inside of a large system that also employs you. Those experiences really allowed us to be very forthcoming in work that we needed to do and work that we needed to change. In that policy, we really just blatantly acknowledge the institutional and historical harms that have occurred. We acknowledge the white supremacist laws upon which our system and every system have been built. I remember multiple times during the creation of the policy and at its passing being asked by people, usually white people, who said, what white supremacist laws? They actually didn't say it like that. They didn't say it with inquiry. They said it with challenge and with offense. What white supremacist laws? To which I said, every law ever since the beginning of time. So the other thing that was really important was the creation of a common language. What are we actually talking about when we talk about equity? What does that mean to us inside of this system? And how do we move forward with that idea in mind? And we have had deep work around equity, and we've had many people in our system who say, I stand for equity, but I didn't mean for it to make me uncomfortable. And so the creation of a common language has really given us opportunity to move forward, recognizing that we need to stand on what we value, that discomfort just means you're doing it, and that all of the privilege that has been a part of many of the experience that we have held, and I include myself in that, what we have is specifically Black students and students with disabilities, which were our two groups that were primarily centered in the policy. And the centering of those groups came because we recognized that those two groups of students are the furthest from justice in our system. And we had to answer the questions that came with what about my child, and how are you going to support the needs of quote unquote all children, which certainly every organization and school system aspires to do. But what we know, we know it deeply, and we have overtly spoken about it, is that when we center our efforts to those who have been the furthest from justice, we therefore lift the experience for everyone, and everyone benefits from that work. So the colorful document that's to the side highlights the implementation areas of our excellence and equity policy. And as you were laying out your targeted interventions, Ms. Diggs and I were labeling on the, that's what we, if you saw us talking while you were talking, that's what we were talking about the content. And we were talking about the ways in which what you shared in terms of targeted intervention is so really connected to what we have identified as areas, because this excellence and equity policy has really just charged all of our departments for the role that they will play in how we select curriculum, and how our hiring practices are impacted, in the type of data that we're looking at, and what our instructional practices are, in how we allocate resources and align our business department and our budget with what we value. Commitment to students. So at the beginning of every school year, we ask employees to sign a document that is a code of ethics, excellence, and equity. And it lists a number of things that we value and that we expect of employees. And so it's something that every employee, regardless of the role that you play in the district, signs. And it's something that we wrote about the people that it's referring to. And so in our own learning around the creation of this excellence and equity policy, we realized we needed to make some revisions to that document. And so this is an example, the commitment to students, where we list how we will support students in Long Beach Unified School District and what that could look like. This was rewritten this year by students. So it's a kind of one of those so brilliant, it's not brilliant ideas to go to students and say, you're not just our customer, you're our partner. And how can we best serve you? And so really working through that document that also has a commitment to community, which community has written, that has a commitment to employees and personnel, kind of the code by which we will operate. Employees are now weighing in on what that experience should be like. And so this is a way of coming together with a common standard of what we expect of our employees and what we hope the experience will be for students and community. So in thinking about how we promote and how we recruit talent, and this is around both recruitment for teachers but also for administrators, we have a really comprehensive equity leadership and talent development office that supports 13 different leadership pipelines. And it's everything from a future teacher to a future administrator, a future assistant principal, a future central office director, all of these various groups. And in that, the infusion of what our expectations are around equity and the need to recruit staff who have not historically been represented, in terms of what we are teaching our leaders. That this has been a really core part of our work. It could be its own several-hour presentation, but I just wanted to highlight as one of the components of the excellence and equity policy that we have really pushed on is the way that we recruit, support, keep talented administrators. With that, we've also created, because you can't just recruit and hope to sustain, you have to build into the supervision and evaluation practices how you keep the leaders in your system. And so as we've gone deeper into the work around equity in our system, we've built into all of our evaluation documents the expectations that we have around the dispositions of an equity-driven leader. And so we've been working, something that was important for our system is to not be so insular to say that nobody other than us can teach us about what we need. And so we've partnered with the Leadership Academy, which is actually housed in New York. And we've really benefited from their teaching around the dispositions of an equity-driven leader. And we've taken those dispositions that are listed here and built them into our domains and dimensions. The domains and dimensions are what we use to evaluate teachers, administrators, staff in our system. And so it's really taking the infusions of what does equity leadership look like, and then what does it act like, and how do we evaluate around it? And so the dispositions that you see on the right side, my right, your left, and then the highlighted components of the domains and dimensions are where we have taken the dispositions and built them into the evaluation tool that we use for administrators. So I wanted to share this as one way of highlighting just the deep intricacy. It's sort of like if you give a mouse a cookie. You know that book? If you give a mouse a cookie, they'll ask for a glass of milk. And so when you start to crack into this work, it's like you start to see we have this excellence and equity policy, and that is not enough, because you can't have excellence and equity here, but not have it here and here and here and here. And that's super important, because something that happens, and it's just a complete component of white dominant culture, is to start to act very exasperated about the ways that we have to continue to do the work. And I want to call that out, because that's been something that we have really had to push ourselves on, and we push ourselves on all the time, is the idea that this value of excellence and equity now has to be deeply embedded and highly valued in other places is actually the work we want to do. It's not annoying, it's not wrong, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't really, really work hard. It means that we're on to something that feels right. So in closing, these are 3 pictures that feel really important. And I'll just share with you, we are in the process of a strategic plan. And the strategic plan is the creation of, we're referring to it as Vision 2035. A current kindergartner will graduate from high school in the year 2035. That's amazing. So we have used, do you have a kindergartner? We have, it's incredible. We have used this vision in the strategic plan that we are in process with right now, where we're infusing much of what I just said and a whole lot that I couldn't say. But in the infusion of that, we are using this concept of this beautiful little human growing to become our graduate in 2035. And what do we expect a graduate portrait to look like? What do we expect an adult portrait, an adult in our system to be supporting at that time? And then what is the system portrait? So that is our strategic planning process, and it's been a super exciting process. The middle are 3 awesome young women who are students at Browning High School, and they have been a part of our student equity leadership team, where really just bringing student voice into all of the things that we're doing, because the beautiful thing about students is they will tell you the real version. They protect nothing in the telling, and they're usually right. They're usually right. And so if we can be a system who listens to them, when we have meetings, they wear these Browning High School blazers. The principal got them as kind of a symbol of, like, you get your Sunday go-to-meeting clothes on and you're there to do the work. And the students love these blazers. So I think that tells something about what students will value when they get to look like the part we're asking them to play. The last picture means so much to me. That's Malcolm. So about 3 weeks ago, I was at an event, and this young man came up to me, and he said, "You look like another lady." And I said, I might be that other lady. And then he went on to tell me that this is Malcolm now at 29 years old. I knew him when he was a kindergartner at Garfield Elementary umpteen years ago. I'm glad I'm still recognizable to him. I'm taking that as a positive. But Malcolm went on to share, I was a school psychologist when I started in the district. Malcolm and I spent a fair amount of time together. He was working on some things. He was challenging our educational environment a lot. But here he is, 29 years old, a college graduate, working for Goodwill Associates in Long Beach, and we reconnected and actually engaged in some future work that we'll do together. So the priceless work of education is that you get to have awesome humans like Malcolm come up and remember a role that you've played, and then also just an opportunity to engage as adults around what we hope to do better. So with that, it'll just add to the conversation to ask Lachelle Diggs and Sharon Barker to come up and share some of the really, really important work that they've been doing on behalf of our early learners in Long Beach. And I thank you so much for the time with you today.
A district that holds equity as such an important part of the work and is the work, so thank you. And in our early learning, like I said, we're continuing to implement equitable practices. I'm Lachelle Diggs, the director of Head Start, and I'll let Ms. Barker introduce herself.
Thank you. My name is Sharon Barker. I'm going to take this off. My name is Sharon Barker. I also am part of Long Beach Unified School District. My voice doesn't normally sound like this, so bear with me, please. What we're going to talk about right now really builds on the earlier presentation and the work that Dr. Brown was talking about, that kind of global equity and excellence that's happening in the district. So we, at Long Beach Unified Head Start, we really started thinking about what is the best way to help the littlest learners in Long Beach, knowing that if we can really target and support those youngest learners, it's only going to make everybody else along the line, it's only going to support everybody else along the line, correct? And so we really started looking at this idea of ACEs, this research that came out of the mid to late 90s, where they were looking at adults who had some pretty serious chronic health issues, both physical health and mental health. And they noticed that adults who had some serious health issues, when they backtracked, they noticed that there was quite a bit of adverse childhood experiences in their lives. Some of those traumatic experiences are listed here. I'm not going to read them all to you, but it really was taking a look at some of our families here in Long Beach who were experiencing violence. And it didn't necessarily mean always violence to them, but violence that they witnessed or they saw. And as we know from our earlier speaker, that when you have marginalized communities that historically have been kind of put off to the side and redlined, through frustration, violence tends to happen. So what we're noticing, what the researchers were noticing, is there were a lot of marginalized communities that were really experiencing high ACEs scores because of these things, because of these systemic racism systems that were in place and that are still going on. So when you looked at this ACEs assessment and you noticed that high scores created this outcome in adults. So you notice that these children who grew up had high diabetes outcomes, had heart outcomes and strokes, that substance abuse issues, that the thought is, so then what do we do to help mediate some of these high scores? Because the idea that, oh, there's a high ACEs scores, that's sad. We're a room full of educators and medical professionals. This does not feel right. So we really started thinking about, so then what? And we realized that through good, high quality, rigorous education, that we can mediate some of those high scores. Oh, sorry, Michelle, I hit before you're ready.
Okay, I think I can go back. There we go. Okay, so following what Sharon said, we looked at our department in Head Start, which is part of the district. So you heard Dr. Brown talk about all of the equitable practices and actual policy and some of the interventions and steps, actionable steps to make the work, equity work, come alive. So in Head Start, which is part of the district, we wanted to make sure we're having some, oh, here we go, technology, sure, here we go. We wanted to make sure that we're in alignment with that practice and the policy as well for our smallest learners. And in Head Start, if you know about Head Start, we have comprehensive services. I know Dr. Martin was part of Head Start, so she knows quite well. But we give comprehensive services. It's not only the academics. We make sure that the whole child and family is addressed, whether that be mental health, health, nutrition, and all the services needed. So we wanted to look at ways we could be more equitable in our practices. And one of the things that happens in a program like Head Start, because Head Start began to eradicate poverty, and a lot of our staff members would say, well, we are equity because this is what we do. And that's true, it's what we do, but there are a lot of practices that we still can examine because, as everyone said this morning, we have institutional racism built into the structure of education, even starting as small as pre-K. So we wanted to examine what are we doing and what can we do better to make sure all students and families' needs are met. So we had some funds that we utilized for a position, and that's, you just heard Sharon. So Sharon, we worked together, and she has a position based on delivering equity PD, or professional development, to our staff. So we work together on what are the needs, what's some of the PD, and she gets the speakers, and she leads a lot of our meetings as well. And from there, we created a leadership team. And our equity leadership team, we have our managers, but we also have some of the teachers and other roles in our organization to come together to talk about equity. And we meet 2 times a month. I won't read all of the roles that come to the meeting. We just wanted to show that we wanted to touch every part of the agency, so we had voice from all staff members. And the focus is to understand anti-bias principles, and we've had lots of PD on microaggressions, implicit bias, just in history of oppression, just to set the foundations for the learning that we had to do in our professional development. And one of the things we're doing right now, we just designed a tool for Equity Walk to go through all of our centers, and we have a criteria to look at in the classrooms. Do the students see themselves represented in the classrooms? Are the books representative of all cultures? Do we have looking at the interaction of teachers and students? Does every student and family member feel that they belong and are connected with the staff? And listening to statements and even nonverbals of staff members, how are children being treated? All of those things that you look for in an environment and that you look for in an interaction to show that you have equity embedded into all that we do. And also, we Beyond the Walls just means we also are learning as we go, and we have a Long Beach Symposium coming up, so that's more professional development for us as well, and it involves community members. And we presented at that symposium last year on equity to make sure our community partners are also in alignment with our practices and just the journey of learning about equity. And our CDC, which is our Child Development Centers in our district, we have a representative from that department as well on our committee. Next slide here. Kind of the same thing. I won't go over everything here, but we are part of also a community of practice with Head Start nationally. We work with other Head Start organizations on creating equitable practices too, just to make sure it's not just our students, but as a nation, we're coming together on identifying practices that we need to change or build into our system. And at the bottom, you'll see our focus continues to be on equity in the classroom, agency-wide equity walk, and we're looking to actually create a strategic plan and making sure equity is embedded in all that we do. Bringing parents, we have parent surveys asking parents, how do they feel coming into our centers? Are we addressing their needs? And even the parents who don't submit the survey, that's one of the things that we looked at. We want to hear their voice too. Because sometimes people don't like filling out surveys, so we say we make sure that we tap into their voice too by just having conversations, focus groups, or drop-off sign in and drop off of students, asking parents questions. And we could fill out the survey, but just maybe fill it out for them as they speak. So just finding ways to get everyone's voice to make sure we're meeting the needs of everyone. See. And here's just Sharon mentioned resilience. It's just showing an activity, ways that in the classroom that you can build equitable practices by having students be resilient. And she talked about the ACEs scores. So here she shows how students are prompted to use their imagination to create a structure using different building materials. And they're challenged to problem solve and how to make the tallest or longest structure, and are encouraged to cooperate with each other. So in a gist, it's just showing how when you have students have collaboration and empathy, it helps to build resilience and to counteract those ACEs scores. And Sharon?
And then this is just another example, because again, if we can't support kids building that resilience, they're gonna be about their ACEs scores. And the last thing that we want are these young kids to grow up with these high ACEs scores that they don't have the skills or the abilities to really mediate those, right? So one of the things we do is really look at kids, their assets, that they come with all kinds of skills, all kinds of cultural knowledge, all kinds of just innate abilities, and knowledge that we may not notice or know about because it isn't the stereotypical 1, 2, 3, ABC kind of knowledge. So we have teachers who really look at what are kids' interests, what do they want to learn about, what do they already know, and then how do we support that knowledge and support their deeper understanding of the content, because we know that when kids feel intelligent, when kids feel that they've got something to share, that they're not going to internalize, talking about some of the 4 I's, they're not going to internalize all that information and all that messaging that's given to them. So this is just an example of a classroom that watched caterpillars turn into butterflies. They went outside and released the butterflies, and the teacher had scaffolding for the kids so that they could then draw pictures of what they saw so they could go home and share that with their families. So their families start perceiving their children as the bright, intelligent little kids that they are, that the parents know that they are, that may not be explained and talked about from the teacher, because the teacher might just be talking about behaviors or things that kids are learning. And then another example is that again, of that feeling of self-worth and self-importance. In February, there was some big celebrations over the Lunar New Year. And again, when kids feel connected to their culture or understand the importance of other people's cultures, and that this is my culture and this is fantastic, and that's their culture and that's fantastic, again, that builds resilience, because you start getting a sense of your self-worth and your family's self-worth and what you have to bring to the table, that when you start hearing those messages from the outside world that sadly our kids do and will continue to hear, if we don't put support in place so that those kids are learning how to mediate what ends up being high ACEs scores, then we've kind of filled our purpose. So here's a quote that I happen to like. I wouldn't say it's my favorite quote. I don't know that I have a favorite quote. I'm not quite as pulled together as Ms. Diggs here, but it's a good quote. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. And I think if we can teach our kids that, if we can teach our kids that concept of courage, of persistence, of resiliency, we will have been successful. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, for both of the presentations, and also Dr. Potevian. I'm so thankful to be here today and to absorb a lot of this. One of the things that I really wanted to celebrate that you highlight in your images is joy, and just the joy that comes, that is infective and infectious from children, right? Like we're really trying to start a new contagion that utilizes and leans on the joy of children, their strength, and their families, and how it's such a beautiful way for us to combat inequities. And so I'm biased. My mother was a social worker, and she worked with Head Start. So I thank Head Start for even being a pediatrician, for having that exposure. And just wanted to know if you could just share a few more of those stories of joy, and wanted to introduce that.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were sharing, I thought you were meaning that we can continue to do that in our work. You meant like, right, give some testimonials and let's think, what are some ones that we can share?
Well, I can share. I was at a school, my time's all messed up, Wednesday, 2 days ago. I was at a school 2 days ago, and I was in a TK classroom, and the kids were in different learning centers. So this is a time of the day where kids can choose what they're going to do, and the curriculum is woven into the different play-based activities. Because again, it's all about joy, right? If we can't help infuse joy into learning, we have failed as educators. So I was in there, and I was at the writing center where there was a bunch of kids, and they were making heart pictures, and they were drawing pictures of themselves in the middle of the hearts. And some of them even had like the little Valentine arrows with the things at the bottom, the feathers at the bottom. They were cutting them out and giving them to their friends and when I asked, oh, what are you doing? And they're saying, I'm making a love letter. I said, oh, what are you making a love letter for? Oh, to tell my friend that I love them and how lucky they are that they're my friend. Not that I'm their friend, but they're my friend. And I thought, oh, look what this teacher's doing. I mean, talking about really looking at, first of all, asset-based, right? This is where the kid is going to learn this concept of empathy and self-regulation and all those skills that if we can't teach our 4 and 5-year-olds, why would we think they're going to be able to sit and engage in a math lesson when they're 10, 12, 18? So she's infused that in part of the classroom. And apparently the little arrow thing is because they're talking about lines and shapes. And so then she started talking about, well, because this is a line. It's a broken line because it's through the heart. And she went on, oh, that's why I do what I do. That's right, right?
I'll share too.
Oh.
Oh, do you have one to share too? Well, Dr. Brown's coming up. I'll share one. This just happened last week. It's very new. We have a student that's new to our one of our classrooms. And speaking of ACEs, is having some great difficulty. His family is having some great difficulty right now. And, that causes kids to sometimes act out because they don't have the words. So I visited the center, and I didn't know the student yet. I was coming to observe, but I hadn't seen the student. I didn't know which student was this student. So I'm walking in the classroom, and they were eating lunch. And a little boy comes up to me and he says, oh, let me introduce you to my friends. He introduces me, first and last name, to every student in that room. And he was so charismatic. And so I said, you're like a little president. I said, you're Mr. President. And he was so excited to be called Mr. President. But then he went on and said, I'm an explorer too. And he started telling me all these things. And I said, after it was over, we walked out, the teacher turned back and said, well, the head teacher that walked me around the center, she said, that's the student we've been calling you about. I said, are you serious? I said, okay, let me tell you. And so this is where I got all excited. I said, you know what, look what happened here. I didn't even know that was a student. I would have never guessed. So what does that tell you? He loves attention. He loves that positive attention. Give it to him. And he has charisma. He's very articulate, he's very smart, and he's very courageous. He came up to me. And a lot of times when you go into classrooms with 2, 3, and 4-year-olds, they're scared of an adult walking in that they don't see every day. But he came up. So I said, he has something. There's a spark there, and you need to cultivate that. So yes, he may have challenges some days because when he goes home, it's hard. But when he comes to this environment, it should be so positive, and he should get everything he needs from you. and you can help the family in the meantime. So that's just one of the stories that was just near and dear to my heart because it just happened. So I am making it a point to keep visiting that student at that school because, now we have a relationship. He's Mr. President.
Well, he's the president, yeah.
He didn't need you to observe him. He needed an employment offer, I think. I love your question about joy, and I just wanted to highlight from a systems lens, we've really benefited from consulting with Dr. Gandhi Mohammed in her work around culturally competent pedagogy. And one of the things that she highlights that is important to our organization, and I would encourage it in every organization, is the idea of using joy as a cultural norm, a cultural type of celebration, and a way of bringing in the cultural competence and the celebration that is often missing when we teach about history. So I love it that you spoke of joy in the way you did, and I think that systemically it's something we could do a whole lot more of. Just wanted to highlight that.
Well, and since we're telling stories, so as Lachelle mentioned, I used to work at Head Start here for many years. I did parenting workshops, and then I went into classrooms like Lachelle did because I was asked to observe and work with some kids. There was a young boy, who I think he was probably 4 years old, and he loved those big wooden blocks that there was a photograph of, and he loved to build towers. But there were other kids in the classroom who loved to tear them down. And he was so angry, and when someone would come and do it, he would hit them, or he'd pick up the block to throw it to them. So I knew what I was supposed to do. So I worked with him, and I talked with him, and I role-played with him, and I played with him, and taught him how to stop and take a deep breath, and that when somebody came forward, throw your hands up instead of out. Up, throw your hands up. And so one day I was observing him, and he'd built this very large tower, and sure enough, up comes a little kid from his classroom to knock it down. And I was like, okay, now, do I wait and see if he does it right, or do I go in quickly? And I got a little closer, and then what he did was, I have to put the microphone down. He went, somebody help me! and I was just like, I just said, look at you. Look what you did. That is so awesome. And he said, I did it. I did it all by myself. And I said, yes. And I said, what can you do now? And he went over to the boy who knocked it down and said, would you come build it with me? And he was beaming. That's a different kind of joy. But it's the joy of learning self-control. It's the joy of knowing you have support. It's the joy of knowing somebody believes in you and that you can change, and you can change others at the same time. So that's what Head Start does. That's what Long Beach Unified School District does. I'm a proud parent of 2 students who are graduates of Long Beach Unified School District. So I certainly want to thank our Long Beach Unified School District speakers. Always good to have you. And I want to thank the audience for being a part of our program today. A very special thank you to Dr. Patricia Poitvin. Thank you for sharing your gifts. Thank you for challenging us, and may you continue to challenge the system. I know you will. And structures, and to make decisions based on hope and possibilities, and to continue to work on what should happen, not what shouldn't happen. So thank you all. Thank you to the family again, and thank you, Dr. Katherine. Good day.